Before his name was ever whispered in fear, before nobles spat it like a curse and servants murmured it like a warning, he had been nothing more than a shadow moving through the Thornhill estate. A body commanded. A voice never heard. A boy shaped by pain and forced silence. They called him Ruin, though the name had never belonged to him. It was stamped onto him the way livestock were marked practical, impersonal, forgettable. But the land remembered him differently. The fields of dying wheat, the bending trees along the ravine, the abandoned servants' quarters rotting behind the kitchens, they all bent subtly when he passed. As if the world recognized a storm building inside a man long before the people around him did, ruin had grown in the estate's underbelly. The stone corridors beneath the manor, cold, damp, always humming with the breath of moss and dust. That place raised him more than any warm hand ever had. Down there, footsteps meant danger. Silence meant survival. And the beat of his own heart was a reminder that he lived only because he refused to break. Even as a young boy, he moved with a stillness that unnerved the other servants. He walked softly, spoke rarely, listened always. His eyes, dark, sharp, absorbing, missed nothing. When overseers tried to provoke him, he did not flinch. When punished, he did not cry. When starved, he simply waited. Patience had become both weapon and armor. Years carved strength into him the way water carves stone. Not loud strength. Not boastful strength. The quiet kind, the kind forged by repetition of labor meant to crush him. Lifting crates. Carrying barrels. Dragging sacks of grain heavier than his own weight. The estate tried to grind him down, but in doing so, it built something harder than intention. The workers sometimes whispered that Rune's silence was unnatural, that he held storms under his ribs, that one day something would snap. But the nobles never noticed him. To them he was background, a functional shadow, a replaceable body. Their arrogance was so deep they mistook his stillness for emptiness. They should have known better. There were moments rare, subtle, when the estate itself seemed to feel the tension in him. On certain nights when the fog rolled low and the sky hung black as a closed lid, Ruin would stand in the fields long after the bells signaled. Curfew, staring, waiting, listening, to something no one else could hear. It was the weight of injustice settling in his bones. It was the echo of every insult, every lash, every moment stolen from him. It was the quiet promise that the land never forgets blood. For years, that promise simmered beneath his skin. Until one winter morning, when the ground froze harder than usual and the manor burned through candles preparing for the annual Noble Hunt feast, Ruin felt the shift. A subtle click inside himself, as if a locked door had finally opened. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was aware that he had become something different from the others around him. Something sharper. Something patient, but no longer passive. The shadows seemed to lean toward him as he walked. The frost-bitten grass bent to his steps. Even the air held still, as if waiting for an inevitable crack, before he ever raised a blade. Before he slaughtered a single guest. Before history etched his name in trembling ink. He was simply Ruin, the Silent One, the one the estate should never have underestimated, the one who had finally, unmistakably, awakened. Thornhill Estate sprawled across the valley like a wounded beast, pretending it was still powerful. From a distance, the manor looked grand tall pillars, polished windows, banners fluttering with the family crest, but up close, the cracks were impossible to ignore. The stone walls were split from years of winter storms. The gardens had grown wild, swallowing statues of forgotten ancestors. Even the air stank faintly of rot, as if decay clung to the estate the way secrets cling to liars. Ruin understood this land better than the nobles ever could. He had seen the corridors where the plaster peeled in thin, brittle sheets. He had walked the cellars where mold climbed the walls like pale veins. He had slept in the lowest servants' quarters where the cold settled so deeply it felt like a second skin. The entire estate was a body one that groaned, shivered, and whispered, and it watched. The wind here never sounded like mere wind. It hissed between the wooden beams with a voice that felt too intentional. At night, when the manor seemed to Hold its breath, the rafters popped and groaned like bones shifting under weight. Even the forest surrounding the property, dense, dark, and ancient, stood like a silent jury encircling the estate, waiting for judgment. The nobles ignored these signs. They laughed loudly, drank deeply, stomped through the hallways without, noticing the way the wooden floors creaked in warning beneath their boots. They lived like people convinced the world existed only to serve them, but the servants knew better. They felt the tension in the soil. They sensed the unease in the air. They whispered that Thornhill was cursed not by sorcery but by cruelty, layered over generations, pressed into the land like fingerprints on wet clay. Each lash given, each child starved, each life crushed under the estate's rule didn't disappear. It settled, it rooted, and it waited. Ruin felt it more deeply than anyone else. When he stepped outside in the early morning hours, the fog curled around his ankles like something alive. When he moved through the barn or the storage sheds, the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer behind him. Even the horses, usually restless around the servants, went unnervingly silent when he passed. He wasn't frightened by it, he understood it. Pain recognizes pain. And Thornhill was drowning in it. The nobles prepared for the annual Noble Hunt Feast, a grotesque tradition celebrating their legacy with roasted meat, barrels of wine, and arrogance spilling from every doorway. Workers rushed everywhere, dragging crates, hanging banners, washing linens, tuning instruments for musicians who would arrive before sunset. Ruin moved among them, quiet, efficient, unnoticed. But while the others worked with fear sharpened by deadlines and punishments, Ruin worked with a different kind of awareness, something colder, calmer. Every corridor he passed through, every door he opened, every shadow he stepped into felt like it was mapping itself onto him. As if the estate was learning him. As if it had chosen him. In the great hall, nobles bickered over seating arrangements, demanding the most flattering light, the most prestigious corner, the most attention. Their laughter sliced through the room, high, grating, oblivious. Not one of them looked at Ruin. Not one of them imagined he could be anything other than a body that lifted, cleaned, served. Not one of them recognized the narrowing stillness in his eyes. The land felt it, though. The walls tightened around the hall. The hearth crackled sharply, almost warningly. Even the dust in the air seemed to hang heavier, as if the estate itself sensed what was coming long before the people inside it. Ruin continued, working. Silent. Patient. Waiting for the moment when all this suppressed tension would finally snap and reshape Thornhill forever. The iron mask arrived at dusk. Ruin felt it before he saw it, an old, familiar weight pressing against the air like a memory rising from the grave. The sky was bruised purple, the wind unnaturally still, and even the birds in the pines refused to call. A wagon rolled up the estate's stone path, its wheels grinding against gravel with a scraping sound far too slow and deliberate. Ruin was carrying a stack of firewood. When he heard the chains. Cold, metallic, unmistakable, he turned. Two overseers jumped down from the wagon, grinning with the smug pride of men who enjoyed hurting things weaker than them. Between them they carried a wooden chest reinforced with iron bands. It rocked slightly as if something inside shifted. "Bring the girl out," one overseer shouted. The manor doors opened. A girl stepped forward, or rather, she was pushed forward, thin, barefoot, shoulders trembling under a coarse gray dress. She was young, but her face had the hollow look of someone who had learned not to cry because crying wasted energy she couldn't afford. Her name was Isa. Ruin had seen her only once, before years ago, when she was dragged into the cellar for punishment and didn't return for 2 full days. She survived, but she came out changed, quieter, paler, moving like someone who expected every wall to hurt her. Now the overseers grabbed her by the arms. "You remember what this is?" one said, kicking open the chest. Inside lay the iron mask, a grotesque thing forged in Thornhill's own workshop, heavy, rusted in places, shaped with the exact cruelty of people who wanted suffering to be slow, suffocating, and humiliating. Isa froze. Her breath shuddered out of her like steam. Her feet curled against the ground as if her body tried to retreat on instinct. but the hands gripping her arms didn't budge. "Lord Henwick says you were found wandering near the north fence," the other overseer sneered. "He thinks you're getting ideas." He lifted the mask. The hinges groaned like an animal waking up. "Let this remind you where you belong." Issa didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply closed her eyes as if preparing to drown in a lake. She'd been thrown into before. Ruin didn't move. He couldn't. His mind split, one part forced to watch the scene, the other dragging him backwards in time to his own childhood. The mask wasn't unfamiliar to him. He had worn a smaller version of it when he was 9. His body remembered the weight, the burning metal against skin. The way the world sounded muffled and far away, his ribs tightened, his jaw locked. Pain is a perfect. Archivist never forgets. The overseers clamped the mask onto Isa's face. She staggered under the weight. The metal rang dully when it settled, and the sound carried through the courtyard like a bell tolling for the dead, through the small holes in the mask. Ruin saw her eyes briefly wet, unfocused, but alive. Then the overseers snapped the lock shut. Click, a sentence, a reminder. Thornhill would always choose cruelty when given the chance. Ruin forced himself to keep breathing. His fingers dug into the firewood until the bark broke. His heartbeat thumped in his throat like a fist demanding to be let out. The overseers laughed. "Put her in the storeroom for the feast," one ordered. "We'll keep her close tonight. Don't want her running again?" They dragged her away. The iron scraped against her cheek. Ruin watched every step, watched until the darkness swallowed her small, staggering form. The estate went silent. The trees leaned in, and something old and buried inside Ruin, something Thornhill thought it had killed years ago, shifted, uncoiled, and breathed for the first time in a long time. A single thought pulsed through him, steady and cold. This ends tonight. Night settled over Thornhill with the kind of stillness that felt staged, too deliberate, too choreographed, as if the land itself were waiting to witness something grim. Torches burned along the manor's walkway, their flames flickering against the humid July air. The workers had been forced to polish every window, scrub every floor, and decorate every corner for Lord Henwick's grand annual feast, a celebration of wealth, a display of power. A night built on the backs of the enslaved. Guests arrived in clusters, carriages rattling over stone, horses snorting in the heat, laughter cutting through the air with sharp, drunken edges. Men in linen coats and women in layered dresses stepped out as though they owned the ground beneath them, commenting loudly on the rustic charm of the estate while ignoring the eyes of those who kept it standing inside the manor. Lanterns glowed like swollen suns. Tables were loaded with roasted meats, glazed fruits, and bottles of imported wine. Music drifted through the halls, violins played by trembling hands. Trying desperately not to make a mistake, Ruin moved through the feast, like a shadow forced to take shape. Silent, controlled, watching. Everyone saw a servant. No one saw the storm building inside him. Henwick strutted through the grand hall wearing a crimson coat and a thick, smug smile. To the guests he was a gracious host. To the workers watching from the edges, he was the architect of their suffering. He clapped loudly, drawing attention. "Tonight," he declared, "we celebrate progress. Prosperity? Order?" Order, a convenient word for violence. Guests cheered, raising glasses that glinted under the candlelight. The sound echoed through the beams like a taunt, but Ruin wasn't listening to Henwick. He was listening for Issa. He scanned every corner, every sound behind the walls. The mask's weight had carved itself into his memory. He could hear her breathing in his mind, shallow and muffled, a whisper of chains, a scrape of metal. A quiet whimper swallowed before it reached the air. He could almost feel the pain, radiating from wherever she had been hidden. The feast carried on in grotesque luxury. A violinist's string snapped mid-song. His hands shook too hard. Henwick barked at him to continue. Guests laughed at the man's fear. Feet thudded across the wooden floors. Boots scraped. Rings clinked against glass. The heat thickened, trapping every sound beneath the rafters until the entire hall felt suffocating. Ruin kept moving, refilling goblets, straightening plates. But in reality he was mapping the room doors, exits, blind spots, shadows. the places a body could disappear. The corners where a scream could be swallowed. Every clang of a fork was a countdown. Every drop of sweat sliding down his cheek was fuel. Several overseers stood along the walls, drinking deeply. They bragged loudly about Isa's punishment, reenacting the moment they locked the mask onto her face. Their laughter cut through Ruin like wire. One said, "Girl should be grateful we didn't bury her." "Henwick wanted that," another replied. "Maybe next time." Guests chuckled. Assuming it was some dark plantation humor, Ruin's vision thinned into a tunnel. For a moment he didn't hear the music. He didn't hear the laughter. He didn't hear the speeches. He only heard breathing his own and Isa's, layered in his mind like two heartbeats. Beating out of sync. He placed a pitcher on a table and met his reflection in its polished surface, calm, blank, dead-eyed. Exactly what they expected a slave to look like. Good. Good. People who underestimate you never see you coming. Then a sound cut through the hall, a faint metallic rattle, carried by the floorboards. No one else heard it, but Ruin did. Isa was directly beneath the grand hall, buried under their celebration, hidden under their laughter, suffocating under their luxury. His jaw tightened, his heartbeat leveled. His plan, up until now only a pulse in the back of his mind, finally solidified into something sharp, cold and lethal. Tonight wasn't just a feast. Tonight was the beginning of the end. The grand hall shook with music, clinking glasses, and drunken celebration. But beneath the polished floors, far below the glowing lanterns and silk-clad guests, the estate kept its oldest secret, and Ruin was ready to open it. He slipped out from the hall under the pretense of fetching more water. No one noticed. No one cared. The arrogance of the feast created its own blind spots, and he had spent years memorizing them. The corridor outside the hall was dim, humid, and silent except for the faint murmur of revelry bleeding through the walls. Ruin walked with the discipline of a man who had spent his entire life pretending to be invisible. At the far end of the corridor stood a narrow wooden door, half-rotted, rarely acknowledged by anyone who wasn't a worker. To most it led to storage. To Ruin it led to the buried truth of Thornhill. He pressed his palm against the doorframe. The wood felt warm, as though it held the echoes of years of suffering. The hinges groaned as he opened it, revealing a steep flight of stone steps descending into shadows. A lantern flickered on a hook. He lit it, shielding the flame with his hand. The light stretched the shadows into long, crooked limbs across the staircase. He descended. With each step, the sounds of the feast faded, the laughter dulled, the music softened, the voices thinned until only the pulse of the earth remained. The deeper he went, the cooler the air grew, but it wasn't a comfortable cool. It was the cold of abandonment, the chill of places forgotten by sunlight. Water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling, landing in a shallow puddle that reflected the lantern's glow like an eye opening and closing. Ruin's breath steadied, his mind sharpened. His heartbeat slowed with purpose. At the bottom of the stairs, the hallway stretched ahead, narrow stone walls, low ceiling, no windows. Once, this place stored crops. Now it stored secrets Henwick didn't want the world to witness. Chains rattled somewhere in the dark. Soft, barely audible, but real. Ruin walked toward the sound, lantern held low, his steps careful and silent. The air smelled of rust, clay, and a faint trace of something human: skin, sweat, breath too weak to rise through the floorboards above. He reached the final door. Iron, heavy, locked with a thick bolt and a rust-choked chain. He leaned closer. "Isa," he whispered, voice steady but trembling at the edges. Silence answered him. Then a faint scrape, as if someone inside shifted their weight. Ruin exhaled slowly, relief hitting him like a distant storm. She was alive. Barely, but alive. He worked the chain with deliberate patience. He had practiced this lock for years, memorizing its grooves by touch during nighttime chores. The metal protested, but he was stronger than the rust, stronger than the years. The chain loosened, the door creaked open. The lantern's glow spilled into the room, revealing a cramped cell of stone, a straw pallet, and a figure curled in the corner, thin as a shadow. Isa lifted her head. The iron mask caught the light, its dull surface pitted with rust, straps biting into her skin. Her eyes, though hollow from confinement, still carried a flicker of the fire she had been born with. Ruin knelt, her breath shuddered. "You came," she whispered, voice muffled behind steel. "Always," he replied. His hands hovered near the mask, but he didn't remove it, not yet, not here. She needed air, water, rest. But the mask was bound with mechanisms meant to require force that would echo through the entire basement. And tonight he could not afford noise. "Not until the right moment. Can you stand?" he asked. She nodded once, weak but determined. He wrapped his arm around her, steadying her frail body. Together they stepped into the hallway, moving like ghosts, quiet, unseen, belonging to the dark more than the living world above. The lantern's flame trembled as though sensing what was coming. As they began the climb upward, Issa leaned closer and whispered through the iron, "They don't know the night is changing." Rune's eyes hardened. "No," he said, "but they will." The quiet steps of the oppressed can be louder than any feast once the night decides to remember them. When Ruin pushed open the final door leading out to the courtyard, a cold breath of night swept over them. Issa blinked rapidly, shrinking back from the air as though it were a creature touching her for the first time, because in many ways it was. She had not seen the sky in years. The moon hung low over the estate, huge, pale, and heavy like an eye awakening after a long dream. Its glow washed the courtyard in silver, softening the hard lines of the stone walls and turning every shadow into a living silhouette. Issa stared at it, trembling. Behind the iron mask, her breath broke. A soft, stunned sound rose in her throat, half sob, half wonder. Ruin steadied her as they stepped onto the cracked stones. "This is the night," he whispered. "You don't have to hide anymore." They crossed the courtyard slowly, each step deliberate. Issa's legs trembled from long years of confinement, but her spirit did not. The wind brushed against her cheeks, slipping through the metal slits of the mask, fluttering her hair. The sensation overwhelmed her freedom in its smallest form, touching her like an old memory. Above, the windows of the grand hall glowed with warm candlelight. Shadows of the guests danced behind the curtains, hands waving, glasses raised, bodies moving with unearned ease. Issa watched them with a strange calm. "Do they laugh tonight as they laughed when they locked me away?" she asked softly. Ruin didn't answer, because he remembered that night. He remembered the music thundering above while Issa screamed below. He remembered the silence that followed, forced, cruel, absolute. And he remembered the hush that fell over the manor for months afterward. Not guilt, just the effort of forgetting her. He looked at the grand hall now, jaw tightening. "They don't know you're breathing the same air as them again," he said. "They don't know the moon has returned you." A breeze stirred. The old oak trees along the courtyard path rustled, their leaves whispering secrets across the stones. Issa tilted her head, listening. "It remembers me," she murmured. "This place. Even if they tried to erase me, the ground didn't forget." Ruin guided her toward the covered walkway. Every shadow seemed to bend toward them, drawn to her presence, the captive who had not broken, only sharpened. Her palms brushed along the wall. The stone felt familiar. This was the path she once ran along as a child before everything changed. Memory rippled, not full images, just fragments. Her hand small, gripping a basket, sunlight on her face, laughter that once belonged to her, then hands shoving her toward the cellar, metal tightening around her skull, darkness swallowing the world. She winced, the mask digging into her skin as she steadied herself. Rune's hand touched her shoulder. "Are you with me?" She nodded slowly. "The night is softer than I remember," she whispered, "but my heart is not." They reached the far end of the courtyard. The wooden beams overhead creaked with the movement of the wind. Lanterns flickered long tongues of flame, bending as though bowing to her. Issa looked up at the moon again. "Did it always watch this closely?" she asked quietly. "It watched you survive," Ruin answered. "It waited for you to step out." Her breath shuddered, but there was strength beneath its strength, growing like a flame fanned by wind. She touched the iron mask, fingers trembling against the cold metal. "One day soon," she murmured, I will remove this under their brightest lights. Not in the shadows where they hid me? Ruin met her gaze, eyes steady. And I'll stand with you when you do. A long silence passed. Not empty charged. Then Issa whispered, "They built their comfort on my silence. Let the night be the last time it protects them." The moon watched, glowing harder, brighter, as if granting her permission. Freedom begins not with the first step out of the dark, but with the first breath that refuses to fear the light. The manor's celebration grew louder as Issa and Ruin slipped along the outer corridor. Laughter spilled from open windows, careless, gilded, echoing off the stone like distant thunder. The guests feasted beneath chandeliers, ignorant of the shift in the wind, unaware that someone they had long buried in darkness was now walking beneath the same roof. Issa paused beneath one of the windows. She listened. The voices inside spoke of trivial victories, land, trades, alliances made over wine, every word dripping with the arrogance of people who believed the world had been shaped for their comfort. She exhaled slowly, her breath soft against the iron mask. "They still celebrate themselves," she whispered. Ruin nodded, as if nothing they've done has weight. Her gaze settled on a lantern hanging from a wooden post. The flame inside fluttered, throwing sparks of amber light across the stone wall. Issa lifted her fingers, letting the warmth brush across the metal of her mask. Then she stepped forward into the shadowed archway. The corridor beyond was quiet, empty, yet the air felt thick, charged, as if it recognized the presence of something long restrained. The walls here were lined with portraits of stern, noble faces. Their eyes seemed to follow her, accusing or warning, she could not tell. Issa did not look away. "You watched once," she murmured to the portraits. "You watched and said nothing?" Issa nodded, though her pulse thrummed like war drums beneath her ribs. They reached the back stairwell. Wooden steps creaked under their weight as they descended. Each sound was swallowed by the vast belly of the manor, absorbed like secrets it had devoured for years. At the last step, Ruin stopped her with an outstretched arm. A lantern glowed at the end of the passage. A figure stood beside it, broad shoulders. Confident posture, a set of heavy keys hanging at his waist, the overseer. He hummed a tune from the grand hall, oblivious. Issa's breath caught. The memory of his voice, older now, but unmistakable, shivered through her. He was the one who laughed when the mask was tightened. He was the one who turned the key in the cell door. He was the one who said she would fade before the next moon. Her fingers curled, Ruin leaned close. "Remember what we planned, a single strike, quiet." Issa stepped from the shadows. The overseer turned lazily, expecting a servant. His relaxed smile faded when he saw the mask. Recognition flared, not immediately, but painfully, like a spark struggling to catch. "You," he breathed. Issa closed the distance in silence. There was no chaos. No noise. Just a swift, calculated movement, precise, controlled, deliberate design not to harm wildly, but to end the threat with absolute certainty. The overseer collapsed into the shadows, breath silenced by the night. Lantern light flickered over Issa's mask, gleaming like a cold moon. Ruin exhaled shakily. "It's begun." The sun had barely dipped when the first horn sounded low, drawn out, vibrating through the wooden beams of the cabin like a warning pulled from the earth's throat. It wasn't a hunting horn. It wasn't a trader's call. It was the kind of sound men used when they wanted to be heard before they were seen. The forest absorbed it, then returned nothing. No echo, just a deepening silence that felt intentional. Ellen stopped mid-step. Her hand hovered above the latch of the door she'd been about to open, breath locked in her chest. The air around her shifted. Even the nearby pine needles stopped whispering. The forest knew. It always knew before she did. Another horn call, shorter, sharper, a signal. She didn't move. She let the silence stretch, let her pulse slow, let her senses sharpen the way they had been trained by years of necessity rather than choice. Footsteps, several pressed along the old road that wound between the trees. Heavy strides, metal clinking, swords that hadn't been oiled in months. Boots belonging to men convinced they were predators. She stepped away from the door, not out of fear but calculation. The cabin wasn't a refuge. It was a trap if she let it become one. Outside, the last of daylight bled across the clearing. Its fading warmth painted the tall grass in a dull gold that could hide movement or reveal it if you knew where to look. She knelt near the window, eyes narrowed. 5 of them. Arrogant in their gait, loud in their breathing, dismissive of the land they trod on. They entered the clearing with the swagger of men who believed the world bent for them. One kicked at her stacked firewood, sending logs rolling. "Think she's already run?" one laughed, scanning the tree line lazily. Ellen's jaw tightened, but she stayed invisible behind the wood-lined wall. A second man spat, "Doesn't matter. If she's close, we'll flush her out. If she's gone, we burn the place and call it done." That was the moment the shift happened, the one she had been waiting for. Their confidence wasn't strategy, it was habit. It blinded them, made them stupid, and stupidity was always a weakness she could weaponize. The leader, a broad-shouldered brute with a red scarf tied around his wrist, took a step toward her door. "Break it," he ordered. The man nearest grinned and raised his boot. Ellen was already moving. She slipped out the back window silently, feet touching the forest floor without a sound. The trees welcomed her the way old ill-eyes do, with cover, with shadows, with paths only she knew. The men at the front still believed everything in the clearing revolved around them. Their mistake. She circled wide, breath steady, heartbeat controlled like the disciplined drum of war. The forest grew denser as she moved behind the cabin, every step bringing her closer to the line where shadow met fading light. The first crack of wood came her door giving way beneath the intruder's weight. They entered loudly. "Check the corners." As if she'd be dumb enough to hide in. He didn't finish the sentence. Ellen watched from the darkness, studying them with the same cold patience the forest had taught her. These weren't the last of her enemies, just the next ones. But the fear that would spread through them after tonight would matter. Fear was a tool. Fear traveled. Fear crippled. The leader stepped inside, barked orders, threw aside chairs like a man trying to prove dominance over wood. But beneath his bluster, Ellen saw it, the first flicker of doubt. The clearing had grown too quiet, no animal stirred. No leaf moved, no wind whispered, the forest was watching. And they finally felt it. Ellen exhaled, slow and controlled, her expression carved into steel. The silence wasn't her shield. It was her invitation. Inside the cabin, the men spread out, their boots scraping across the floorboards. The arrogance they'd arrived with still clung to them, but it was thinning fast, peeled away slowly by the unnatural stillness outside. The leader raised a hand. "Stop." The others froze. He wasn't the smartest of the bunch, but even a dull blade could feel when it was being pressed against its own neck. His eyes slid toward the windows. The fading light cast long, warped shadows across the interior shadows that didn't behave the way they should. Too slow, too heavy, too deliberate. "Where? Is the wind?" one of the men whispered, because he finally noticed what Ellen had known from the moment the first horn sounded. Not a single branch moved. Not a single bird called. Not a single sound existed except their own breathing. Ellen didn't step into view. She didn't need to. She let the silence grind against their nerves like a sharpening stone. The leader exhaled sharply. "Fan out, she's close." He wasn't wrong. Ellen moved along the cabin's outer wall like a shadow peeling itself from the bark of the trees. Her knife, darkened from years of use, gleamed once where the last thread of daylight kissed the blade. Then the light was gone, and so was the gleam. Inside, one of the men leaned toward the broken doorway. "Maybe she ran?" "Maybe you shut up," another snapped. Real panic was starting to chew at their confidence. They'd expected a frightened woman, not a ghost forged by years of stolen childhood and silent survival. They had come to claim dominance. Instead, they found themselves being studied, measured, weighed like livestock before slaughter. Ellen stepped between the tall grass and the wall of the cabin. The shadows swallowed her whole. She listened. 3 inside the main room. 1 near the back door. 1 to the right window. Predictable placements, predictable men. They treated the environment like an enemy that needed to be conquered. Ellen treated it like an ally that had been waiting for her return. The man near the back door leaned out, scanning the tree line with jittery breaths. "Nothing," he muttered. "It's too damn quiet." Ellen moved behind him, silent as falling ash. He didn't feel her until the moment she pressed the blade under his ribs upward, precise, cutting breath before sound. He choked once, a wet, broken gasp, and she lowered him to the earth without letting his fall make a whisper. Inside, a man called out, "Doran, you see anything?" Ellen dragged the body into the shadows. It disappeared into the tall grass as if swallowed by the land itself. She didn't answer. She let the forest answer for her with deeper silence. The leader stiffened. "Doran?" He barked again, louder now. Still nothing. He motioned toward the back. "Check on him." Another man stepped toward the door slow, cautious now. The arrogance had bled out of him, replaced with the realization that he wasn't hunting anything. He was being separated from the others. He reached the threshold and hesitated, breath fogging slightly despite the warm air. "Ellen," he called out tentatively, trying to twist her name into a threat. "Come out, girl. Enough of this hiding." It was laughable. He didn't even believe his own voice. Ellen watched him lean just a little too far, enough to expose the side of his neck. One clean motion, a hand over his mouth, a blade across his throat, a body eased into the grass. The clearing swallowed him too. Inside, the remaining three felt it. Not heard, felt the weight of the forest tightening like a noose. Their leader's bravado jutted up one last time. "She's playing games," he growled. "No," another whispered, eyes darting to the dark windows. "She's hunting us." The truth settled like frost in their bones. Ellen walked the perimeter now, every step slow, deliberate, inevitable. Her silence wasn't an absence, it was a verdict. The hunt had finally turned, and they were running out of men to lose before that truth became undeniable. The moon hung low over the Georgia pines, silvering the earth with a cold, deliberate light. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, entwining with the thick underbrush, and for the first time in years, the world felt like it belonged to Ellen, not to the oppressors, not to their arrogance, not to the masters who had thought her silence and suffering would last forever. She had returned, and the night itself was her accomplice. The remaining men stumbled through the clearing, panic finally breaking their once proud facades. Their confidence had been stripped in increments, replaced with desperate calculation. Every rustle, every snapping twig, every faint whistle of wind felt like an accusation. They had been loud when they arrived, certain of dominion, convinced that a woman confined for decades could never wield power against them. Now they understood. Her patience had been a weapon, her silence a strategy, her every step a verdict. Ellen crouched behind the twisted trunk of a magnolia, listening to their ragged breaths, feeling their fear as if it were an extension of her own. One man froze mid-step, caught in a shaft of moonlight. His shadow stretched grotesque across the damp earth, exaggerated, mocking. Ellen did not move immediately. She let the fear settle, let it grow, let it become unbearable. Then, with a motion precise and choreographed, she emerged from the darkness, fluid, silent, a storm given human form. The first man gasped, but it was too late. She struck not in rage, but with methodical clarity. The forest absorbed the motion. The night swallowed the sound. The others barely had time to react before they too were confronted with the inevitability of their reckoning. Their screams, or what little escaped their throats, died in the trees. There was no chaos, only the inevitability of a long-denied justice descending upon them. And yet, in the midst of this calculated execution, Ellen's mind remained clear. Rage had not consumed her. She felt the weight of each moment, the responsibility of power finally in her hands. She remembered the years spent beneath the iron mask, the darkness that had been imposed, the stolen sunlight, the silenced years. Each memory sharpened her focus, guiding her movements with unerring accuracy. This was not revenge for spectacle, it was correction, balance, and truth laid bare. By the time the clearing was emptied, by the time the last man had fallen or fled, the moon had climbed higher, casting a pale glow over the bodies, the earth, the twisted branches. The forest exhaled in the silence that followed. Ellen lowered herself to the ground, kneeling briefly to touch the soil that had once confined her. It was a reclamation, both literal and symbolic. She was no longer a captive. She was a force, a presence, a shadow that would not be forgotten. And as she rose, the wind stirred through the trees, whispering through the leaves like the hushed voices of witnesses. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a sound sharp and clear, marking the passage from night into legend. The men who remained alive fled, carrying fear that would outlive them. And in the hearts of those who would later hear the story, Ellen became something more than a woman. She became a myth. A quiet terror, a patient shadow, a reminder that no imprisonment, no matter how long, could suppress the power of truth and the inevitability of reckoning. The clearing lay empty now, save for the twisted, silvered limbs of the forest and the moonlight tracing paths across damp earth. And in that stillness, Ellen removed her mask, letting the metal fall away, revealing eyes that had seen centuries of pain and emerged unbroken. For the first time in decades, she breathed the open air fully, not as a servant, not as a captive, but as a being who had reclaimed herself entirely. She was the storm that had come silently and left the world altered forever. A silence older than cruelty itself fell over the forest, and in it, a legend was born, a shadow that would haunt memory long after flesh and bone had faded.